Hello everyone, today I'm going to talk about Sitecore patching. This is probably one of the biggest topics that I could possibly ever talk about, and I'm surprised I've waited this long to actually bring up this topic and kind of talk about it. Just to talk about this real quick, this is not a Sitecore 9 tutorial, this is more of a guidelines for anything before Sitecore 9. Some of the features have changed quite drastically in Sitecore 9, and I'll showcase those in the future. But this will kind of be very useful for those that are still working with, for example, Sitecore 8.2 or 8.1, 8, or even back as far as 6.6. So we're going to talk about some of the concepts and things that you can do with patching. What is exactly patching? It basically is this concept that you have this kind of default configuration. Let's say if you're working with .NET, you'd have a web.config, and essentially that's exactly what you have here is a web config, but then you can actually start to extend it via other configurations, not necessarily just to add to it, but also to delete things from it, to patch over things, etc. So that might seem very basic and might not seem like it would be that powerful, but think about it like this. Out of the box Sitecore, you have a web config in there that you're basically saying pull in the sitecore.config. That's assuming you're working with the later versions of 8.0. 8.0, I believe, was the version that they didn't have it, and then in 8.1 they split up the Sitecore config into a different patch that basically patches the web config, and then that also is patched by other configs. So out of the box, all those configurations exist. What if you wanted to extend Sitecore? Let's say you wanted to add an additional site to it. So inside the configuration, I actually have something called show config, which I'll discuss here in a second. There is a section in here for the sites that you defined, and I've probably covered this a little bit in other tutorials, but never to the lengths that I'm going to in this session. So if I continue to search for sites, down here, right here, there is a site section. Out of the box, you're going to get most of these configurations up till this one, which this is actually a patch config. So out of the box, Sitecore, you have this basic installation. How do you start extending it? And that's really the beauty of Sitecore. It's all about patching this configuration, their default configurations, with additional patch configurations. So you'll define when you start setting up your project, either if it's a Helix project or if it's a regular project, you're gonna find scenarios that you're gonna want to patch the traditional or existing out of the box Sitecore configuration. Like I just said, the most common one is the sites, but there's other ones if you want to add additional settings to Sitecore, or if you wanted to add events or commands or a long line of things, which I'll show some of those here in a second, what they are and where they exist inside this configuration. And then I will also show near the end of this tutorial how you start patching these configurations using the different types of patching options that you have from Sitecore. To get started, let's talk about the ordering of patching. The way it works is if we go back to kind of a folder structure here of Sitecore, we're going to go out to my example project, which sits here inside Sitecore, example A2, and we go into the website. Now inside here, there's a folder called app config. This is where all your configurations live. I mentioned here in a few minutes ago about the web config. I'll just quickly look at this just so you can get an idea of how this kind of works. Let's just open this in Notepad. This is a standard web config, and there's going to be times where you're not going to be able to patch something. Let's say you wanted to, this is a bad example, but if you wanted to patch your connection strings, that's not necessarily a patch, although with this, it would be sort of a patch, or you could potentially patch it because it's saying config source is this app config connection string. So you would actually go into this connection strings and modify it. So you wouldn't necessarily need to modify it as part of this main web config, but there's other scenarios. For example, this was, I believe I talked about this in the past, but if you wanted to add things related to unobtrusive JavaScript and things like that related to Cure.net, you can't patch the Sitecore configs because they're not even included at this level. The Sitecore configs and then the ones that you start patching are actually defined here. So you have a Sitecore base element this XML file, and then the config source points to the app-config sitecore.config, which is in the app-config folder, which I'll start to show here in a second. So this is really where you start. This is the one that you'd want to patch. This is where everything to do with Sitecore exists. So the only time you'd want to come in here and start modifying the base config, in this case, you probably wouldn't be using a patch because there really is no concept of a patch. You could theoretically add a config source and then specify a path that where that exists outside of this web config, which might be a good idea in some cases. But if you're working with Sitecore, you're going to just be using this this option, and you can see it's like a standard web config in here. So let's back out and then go into this app config. So in here, you'll notice that what you're going to see is basically all the kind of configurations that are pulled in from the web config, and you'll see an include folder. The way this kind of works is this folder is basically all about things that are specified in your, either pulled in from the Sitecore config or pulled in from that main web config. So where the patching really starts to take place is inside this include folder. The way this works, and this is very important to keep in mind, and we'll try to kind of showcase this a little bit. If you do it in a different order than the way the patches are pulled in, then it might affect the way your patches come out, or your total patched config comes out. It's not so much about patching as early as possible. It's about patching as late as possible. So you want to be, if you're adding a new setting or you're overriding the base, let's say you're changing a command, for example, and you're just totally overriding that, you would want to pull that in as late as possible. The way it works is it's pulled in alphabetically. The first thing to know is the root folder, this root folder, everything in here is going to pull in alphabetically at first. So obviously 001, Sitecore speak, important, would be pulled in as the first item in this. Basically, it's going to loop through this collection of configs. It's going to run this one first, and it's going to run this one at the bottom last. The zglass mapper.sc.view render. And you'll notice that oftentimes the things that are lower down are also going to be things that are third-party extensions, things like that, because they're trying to overwrite the configuration. And then what you're going to want to do is set it up so that you end up overwriting their configurations as well, potentially as well. Now, a lot of these are alphabetical, and that's fine. If you're building something and it doesn't really matter, you don't think anybody's ever going to have a setting called your module.screen name or whatever it may be, then there's really no reason to purposely try to make that patch come in as late as possible. You could probably make it come in as early as possible and then allow others to patch it. If you try to push it so it's later in the patch cycle and then you're like, well, that's good. But what's going to happen is now the next person that wants to potentially patch your config is going to have to go even further in lengths of trying to make it so that their stuff comes in even later. The first thing to run is the folder itself. So the root folder, not the folders inside that root folder, but the folder itself would run alphabetical. And then what it would do is run these folders alphabetically, and everything inside of that would be alphabetical. So it's basically keeps going down that chain. So if you had folders inside any of these folders and they had multiple folders, you might want to make, if you wanted those patches to be last, using kind of a prefix that you can see down here in the folder. So the folders run last, are the last sections of the site to run. So really, if you really want stuff to be pulled in at the last point, you'd want to prefix stuff with Z. Multiple Z's, the more Z's you do, it's all alphabetical, just keep that in mind. Z is the last letter in the alphabet, so obviously Z is where most of your patches are going to be found. It's kind of an interesting thing to see. One potential issue with this I've seen is Helix. Keep in mind when you're working with Helix, it's all about foundation, feature, and project. For those that haven't worked with Helix, just watch my tutorials on Helix, you'll understand what I'm sort of talking about. If you don't, just skip over this section. But one of the challenges with Helix is that you'd want your foundation to run first, you'd want your feature to run next, and you want your project to run at the very last point. If you think about it, foundation would actually run after feature because it's done by alphabetical. Foundation is actually later because the E in feature would run first. So you don't really want that, but that's something to keep in mind. So if you were naming your folders inside your Helix project, first off, if you call them foundation, they would actually run really strange sets. So foundation and feature would be up here, and then your project would be after M. That's something to keep in mind as well. So you might want to prefix the folders that you do for patching for Helix with Z's, so that way they run last. But you might also want to number them or something like that, just so you can enforce that the feature or the foundation runs first, the feature runs second, and the project runs last. All right, so that's pretty much it. I'm all going to go on to that topic, but it's important to note about that. There's ways you can modify configuration patcher to make it so it changes that order or changes the way all of this works. I'm just going on the base setup of how that's set up. So that's pretty much it for ordering, and that's why you always see these crazy Z's in projects, and it's important to know about that. Next, I'd like to just kind of look at two important topics, and you saw it before. So what am I looking at? You're probably seeing this huge document. There's a lot of things in it. This is basically the combined patch. This is only relates to the Sitecore patch. So this doesn't relate. You're not going to see all the web config stuff in here related to connection strings and things like that. This is just your Sitecore config patch, the final result of that. So as you start moving into this world of patching your configurations, and let me just really talk about why you'd want to patch your configurations. I've already talked about the obvious. You theoretically could go in and just go into your Sitecore config that I showed in the folder here, and you could just make changes directly to this item. But the problem with that is that when you go to update Sitecore in the future, you're gonna potentially lose those changes. You're potentially going to make it so that your Sitecore instance can't be updated or can't be updated as easily. So it's really important to patch, and that will allow you to support these changes that are going to happen in your Sitecore instance as you upgrade your version. It's really for upgrade reasons, but it's also for extensibility. It allows other people to patch your stuff and people to patch your stuff that are outside of your company. So if you start making changes to core Sitecore root config, and then you install a module, that module may not work as you expect it to, because it's expecting certain elements to be in your main Sitecore config that maybe you've just changed that will now no longer work. So never ever go into your Sitecore config and make changes to it directly. Never make changes to really any of these configs directly except for potentially connection strings. You'd really want to go into your include and make a patch of those Sitecore configurations, so that way the upgrade path is still available and other modules will work with your source as easily without you finding out that it doesn't work and you don't know why, and then you find out it's because you've really changed the way the Sitecore config was originally set up. So looking for this document, you can see a few things. I'm going to talk quickly about SE variable. This is a concept of, you can actually define more of these. So you could define a SE variable, and you can call it, you see these in the Habitat project. You see this in a little bit in Unicorn. Just specifying a path to the Unicorn, the YML files for Unicorn. So you'd specify a path, and then all your configurations that you're pulling into this for Unicorn would use that path within the config. So it's actually kind of cool. And I'll potentially show this when I do a session on Unicorn coming out, but about how you'd add new ones of these, and you can really customize and make your configurations really easy to use. Instead of having specific paths in all your files, you'd have just one file that has specific paths. Basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to make changes inside this Visual Studio project, and then we can watch how they affect that patch config, and I'll show how that applies as well. So actually, let's just do that. Let's just steal this guy, and we'll use this in an example in a second, and I'll show how you know it came from what patches. If we go into the example web project, you're going to see that I have actually an app config include, and I have created this z.example. This is basically saying this folder is actually going to run near the end of the patches that will run in Sitecore instance. So we're pretty much sure that, if you have a sites here, this is going to run last, or near the last, unless you have a ZZZ or something like that, which I think we did, but that might have been for extending something else. I'm not exactly sure where that came from, but let's go ahead and we're going to talk about the first type of patching, which is probably the most common and actually is represented right here in the site definition. This is just merging in an item. So this is like I was talking about with building custom components for Sitecore. This is probably the most common. You're not going to necessarily be patching existing configurations. You're going to probably be patching and adding in this concept of, hey, I have a new event that's going to run, and this event I want other people to patch potentially in their environments. An example of this is the site definition. You might want to add a new site to the site or to the site's definition. And this is exactly what I've done. I've created this example site. All it is you basically just define anything. You don't have to come up with like you will see here in a second, there's all these patch attributes that you could use if you're going to patch something, if you're going to replace it instead of, or if you're going to delete it, or if you're going to before or after things. You're going to be doing more things that require more keywords, whereas this is very straightforward. It's really as important as just specifying configuration here at the top. This is kind of a standard XML thing. Then you define a Sitecore node. So you're just going to mirror the structure of that XML, the main XML. You're going to specify Sitecore so it knows it's part of the Sitecore, and then you're going to specify sites so it finds the sites item inside your XML, and then it's just going to add, because it doesn't already have an example site as part of its configuration, it's just going to go ahead and add this or merge it into your existing Sitecore config. So this is pretty straightforward, and we go back to here. Let's do example sites. That might get us. You can see this site definition has been added. So it's not replacing an existing one. And like I was saying before, you can know where it came from by this thing at the end. So it says patch source sites.config. This can really help you to diagnose issues with your configuration. So if you added a patch, you were trying to overwrite something, and you go in here and you see it's patched, but it's not the right file that's patching it, you know that something is overwriting your stuff. You might need to increase the chances of your code running last instead of first, like it could be. Example would be adding an X to it, or adding an X to your configuration, or adding a folder or a Z. Actually meant a Z, not an X. Or an X could make sense in some situations as well. You can go add a folder called Z. If it's already a folder called Z, you can add 2 Z's, and then you know it's going to run last. So that's pretty straightforward. Merging is pretty simple concept. You find a folder. This could be a settings item, so you could just have settings. Let's go up here to settings. So I could go and just call this setting name whatever, and then the value of whatever, and then just like that. And now this should be part of my configuration. It will merge this into that settings item, and then it will allow us to see this setting. So you're just adding settings to the configuration, allowing you to do different settings for whatever your scenarios are. So let's refresh this. It's asked me to log in because I hadn't logged in a while. My password is just B in my local instance. And now it's going to just kind of do this funky thing as it tries to basically pull in all your patch configs and build this combined config. The first time it runs, it takes a little longer, but after that, it caches the configuration, and then you're set to go. So what I'm going to do is search for whatever. Here it is. It's added a new setting. Name is whatever, value is whatever, and the patch source is my settings.config. Very useful to know the name of the config, and you can see it's just added it in. So let's go on to the next topic. So the next topic is inserting. There's inserting before and after. There's really not inserting just in general, because it wouldn't know where to add it. Because really, if you're going to insert something and you just want it to be wherever, you would just do the merging technique. So if you wanted to add a setting like I just showed you, it would just be just adding that setting, and that's inserting it. But inserting is the concept of adding it into a specific place inside your configuration. I'm going to save this, and I'm going to go back to pipelines. And this is really where we're going to take advantage of this, is in your pipelines. The way the pipelines work is they all run sequential. So if you had, for example, this is the initialize, there's usually typically 5 steps that happen in the initialize. It runs basically, the first one runs, the second one runs, the third one runs, the fourth one runs, etc. So it's important that when you're patching the pipelines, that you add it to a specific spot. You don't want it to run as the last one, unless that's your goal. You want it to be the very last process in it. Then you'd probably use the merging technique just to add it, and that would add it to the end. But if you wanted to add it to after, in the example for this one, after the initialized global filters, you would patch it and say patch before this item or patch after. And this one really kind of shows how easy that is. So you have a processor, you've defined a specific type. This relates to this item down here. Let's pull up this item. So application start. So this application start, all it has is a process. This is part of the pipeline terminology or process, which hopefully maybe I'll show how to do these in a later session. But I've kind of covered this in the past in my bundling and minification course that I did on YouTube that you can refer to, of how I created this register bundles and I created the process. And because it's a pipeline and it's processors running, you'd want to define and put a public void or process around it, and it's passing in pipeline args to it. And like I said, it runs in succession. So the initialize has maybe 5 processes in it, and it's going to run each processor one at a time. So it's going to run process 1, process 2, process 3, and it's going to pass these pipeline args back and forth between those different things. So you could, if you wanted to pass specific variables across your processors, then you would do that using that. To showcase this, what we'll do is we'll just go ahead and show this patch before. So we're basically saying before the initialized global filters, we want to see this application start. So if we go back up here and we search for that, we will see that we have this processor defined inside the initialize pipeline. So this is the pipeline, and these are all the processors. This is the default out of the box processor for Sitecore is this initialized global filters. It's actually a patch. If you notice, it's actually coming from your Sitecore.mvc stuff. So if you don't use MVC in your Sitecore instance, you're using web forms, you might not see this patch. So this patch specifically relates to MVC. And since what we built, which was bundling and minification, we wanted that to relate to MVC specifically. We're saying patch this example application start before this initialized global filters. And as you can see, it's specifying its pipeline. What if we wanted to patch this guy after? Well, it's as simple as just doing a patch after. So patch after, save, publish, and then reload the site. So as it loads, as I said, the first load is kind of a little slow. But as you can see now, this initialized global filter is showing up first, and now you see the application start showing up after. Exactly what we wanted. There's also one other option you have here. You could patch instead of. So you could say, I don't want this initialized global filters for some reason. You want to remove it, and then maybe you're going to build something that inherits all the methods and all the options that are part of initialized global filters. If you're using the .peek or something equivalent, IL-SPY, to view the DLL, what's in this initialized global filters, you could potentially pull out the code. I wouldn't recommend that. I would actually inherit it if possible, and then you could write some additional logic, whatever it may be. It probably doesn't make sense in this case. I don't know. I don't remember exactly off the top of my head what initialized global filters is doing, because I wrote this a while ago. If I looked at .peek, I could find out what it's doing. And that's how you really just start determining where and when you should start patching things. So if I patch that, patch instead, do a publish and refresh it, and it's going to take a few seconds to load. First load, always the slowest. And now you'll see that you don't see this method that I defined anymore. Where you don't see the initialized global, I forgot what it's even called, initialized global filters. No longer do you see it. You see now the method I created instead, and it's just replacing it. One other option that you have, without going too far with blowing up my instance here, is that you could also do a processor patch, or not patch. I'm going to say type .mvc.pipelines loader initialize. I should probably just copy this, make more sense. You just want to watch me type it out. If you did, well, too bad. And then that's it. But inside here, you actually have the ability, and let me comment this guy out. You can actually patch and delete things as well. So you can say patch delete, and I will do the other way of doing it. And then if I publish this, it should delete that and not add anything instead of it. So it should just be gone. So we come back here, and now you see a few things. One, I commented it. I don't know why it added it, but it just added the comments there. I didn't know it actually would do that, but it kind of makes sense because I'm in my config here. I'm specifying the initialize, and I'm specifying this, so it just would add that in as text. But one other thing you notice is that that initialized global filter is no longer here. It's nowhere to be found. So if we search for it, there is no copy of that in this document. There is in my comment here, but there is none defined anymore. So if you want to delete all the patches for some reason, and you could do that if you wanted to play around with Sitecore and see how bad you can blow up your environment. You could do that. So instead of going in your Sitecore config and deleting everything, you could just create a patch config that says delete all these files, and you could just delete all the configurations out of. You could just completely remove a pipeline, for example. I mean, I could go in here, for example, and instead of doing this, I could do a patch delete of the initialized, the actual pipeline itself. Instead of deleting a processor, I'm going to delete a whole pipeline. In theory, this will work. A lot of this I have never tried before, but in theory, since it's all just standard options I'm doing here, here's a prime example. So if you try to delete something, you might get an error saying that you can't delete a pipeline. So it would have let me do it. There might be pipelines that you could patch, and that you could say patch delete this whole pipeline. But yeah, let's not do that. So let's just take that back to the way it was, so my code will work still. Pretty much it for that. There's one last piece I wanted to talk about, which was attributes. This will relate to, there's a lot of places that you can do this. So if you just wanted to patch an attribute, you could patch theoretically, you could patch it. It's like the instead that I was using before. You could patch just the processor known as this, and then you could patch its value. So for example, let's just do that real quick. Show how this kind of works. Just comment this guy out again, and then that way I can have it back. And then I can do a processor of, or type this, and then I will do a patch attribute name being the name that you want to patch. So it's not the name is not this, for example. It's the name of the attribute you're trying to patch. So I'm trying to patch the type up here. So I would call this type, and then I would set the value to this guy. This is the other one. This is similar to, so what I'm similarly doing here is I'm actually doing a patch instead in a sense. this works as well. So let's just go ahead and publish this, and let's just refresh. So as you see down here, let me see. Actually, I'm already here. So basically, as you can see, it's kind of crazy, but the way I'm patching this, and it makes this kind of hard to read actually, because I didn't realize it did this, but your processor is being patched by Sitecore MVC config. This was the original patch, but then I did a patch attribute. Because of that, now the type is specifying this application start. So it's actually kind of misleading, because this is not actually where it's patched at. It's actually patched in the pipelines config that I had defined. But now this is basically like doing it instead. If you use instead, I would say the instead is the best way to handle that scenario. Patch attributes are better and probably make more sense in certain areas than it does in the pipelines area or building or in your processes. I'm just going to change this back to what it was, like that, and then save it. And then what I really want to do is actually do patch attributes in settings. So I'm actually already doing one here. You might have noticed it from before. I'm taking this ignore URL prefixes, which is a Sitecore out of the box definition, and I'm saying ignore certain prefixes, basically allowing me to run code. So this was for the bundles, the bundles and minification stuff that I set up. This basically handles that. So it's saying anything with the /bundles, just ignore it. Don't try to bring it into Sitecore to start having it processed, and let the bundling engine run it. This patch attribute is just saying patch the value of this item. So this had an item. This setting name had a value that was set to something else, and I'm setting its value to something completely different. And this is essentially how you would do that. So what we can do is now we can just see what this looks like inside our configuration. What we should expect to find is that ignore URL prefixes will now have a value that includes the bundles at the end. You could do this with other things as well. If I had defined that whatever guy in this config, and then I could have had another config with maybe z on the end, z dot whatever dot config, and then it would have patched this settings config. So if we go here, we can go and we can find URL, I don't remember exactly what it's called. Ignore URL prefixes. Should be able to just search for this. So in this guy, now you'll see that bundles is at the end. And also, so if you do a patch attribute, it's not going to show where it came from. So that's important to note. It might make it harder to find where your patch is coming from, but it's, yeah. So anyways, that's pretty much it on patching. Pretty useful video. If you have any questions about patching, please let me know. I'm hoping, and I've had this idea for a long time, is just to build a patching database of different patches that you can do. Component patches, like let's say you want to do a link manager patch. How would you do that? If you wanted to do a patch of other various things, how might you do that? But what you have here is a fundamental understanding of how you would do the different patches, how the which patching options you have, patch attribute, patch insert, not patch insert, but patch instead, patch before, patch after, and just the whole concept of merging. Also, we've talked about how it determines where to pull in which patch first kind of scenario, or which patch last. So all that's very useful. So like I said, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me in my LinkedIn and my Twitter account, and hopefully this will lead you down a best practice path. Have a nice day. I'll talk to you guys later.